Don't you even dare pretend you were clueless about what you've done. My mother's voice, all fury and contempt, blasted through the phone speaker so loudly that I actually pulled it away from my ear. We're your family, and you can't just abandon us because you're suddenly upset. Get over it. I stood there, stuck in my tiny home office, staring through the streaks of April drizzle that hammered against the windows of my rented townhouse in St. Clair. My mother's words kept echoing, and I felt a bizarre combination of emptiness and fiery anger swell inside me. In a single day, my entire understanding of who my parents and brother were had shattered into dust. And it all began with one text message that my brother Ronan inadvertently sent to our shared family thread, not to the private chat he used with my parents to talk behind my back. My name is Skylar Jones. I'm 35 years old, and until the previous afternoon, I believed I was being a noble daughter by helping my aging parents afford a somewhat peaceful retirement. After graduating from college, I had worked tirelessly to build a successful marketing consultancy from scratch. It thrived beyond my wildest hopes roughly 6 years ago. Ever since my company turned profitable, I'd begun sending monthly funds to my parents. They'd spent a lifetime scraping by on meager income, so I wanted to make sure they didn't stress about everyday bills. I truly believed I was doing the right thing, but now I knew exactly how they saw me, a convenient human ATM. My brother's misguided text was so blunt that I could still picture the words searing my phone's screen. The family's cash machine just tossed us a new $3,000. Then came my dad's cruel reply. Ha ha ha, keep milking that gravy train. She's too dumb to realize we're using her. My mother chimed in right after that. She just paid for those fancy golf clubs Samuel's had his eye on. If Skylar realized how we keep diverting funds to our hobbies, she'd lose it. The screenshots kept rolling in, a disturbing record of years. Years of them discussing how to manipulate me, pressing guilt buttons and playing the "we're broken sick" card in an effort to get even more money out of me. The deeper I scrolled, the sicker I felt. Ronan attempted to delete the incriminating messages in a panic, but it was too late. I had seen enough to know the truth. All day I'd been bombarded with texts and voicemails from them. Dad said they were just joking around. Mom insisted I misread everything. Ronan claimed he just went along with it to appease our parents. Yet the vile contempt in their own words was undeniable. Outside, the April rain battered the siding, as though in sync with the storm of anger inside me. The entire time I was scraping money together, truly worried that they wouldn't have electricity or hot water, they were cruising around town, using my deposits for luxuries. They all found it hilarious that I was so gullible. Suddenly, a jarring knock snapped my attention back to the present. At the threshold was my brother, drenched by the downpour, looking uncharacteristically forlorn. I stared, uncertain whether to open the door, but my pulse was pounding with a need for answers. Perhaps I did want to hear what he had to say, if only to let him know how sickened I felt by his betrayal. I swung the door open, blocking the doorway with my body. Rain splashed at the threshold. "What do you want?" I demanded, voice cold. Ronan appeared ready to collapse. "Skylar," he whispered, shivering from the wet gust. "Please let me in. I need to explain." "All right," I said, but without moving aside. "Explain how you all treated me as your private piggy bank for years?" I brandished my phone, its screen showing a nasty text of his. "Just tricked Skylar into sending more money for Dad's big dental bill. Ha ha." He blanched. "It's not like that. At least it's not what it looks like." I could practically taste the bitterness on my tongue. "How could it not be?" I shot back. "Ronan, I've been depositing over $3,000 every single month for half a decade. That's $36,000 each year. Total. Don't try to pretend you didn't realize how much it was." Ronan lowered his gaze to the soggy welcome mat. Yeah, I know that's a lot. It's $180,000, Ronan. That's not even counting the so-called special emergencies. Dad's endless medical problems, Mom's furnace that suddenly died last winter, the used car fiasco. I swallowed all those stories like an idiot. He flinched, cheeks reddening. "I know," he murmured. "We got too comfortable, but they're getting older and they said they were desperate." I glared at him. Older? I said, practically spitting out the word. They're in their mid-60s, not ancient. Dad's out golfing most weekends with the fancy clubs I bought, while I believed he needed prescriptions for a weak heart. Why didn't any of you pipe up, at least once, to tell me the truth? His reply spilled out in a trembling rush. They led me to believe you wouldn't mind if we just borrowed a bit more. It spiraled. Now they can't pay their mortgage on the waterside condo. They're terrified and they need you. Conflicting emotions stormed inside me. Heartbreak, anger, disgust, and against all logic, a small slice of pity. Before it fully gripped me, another memory of a vile text shot across my mind, reminding me that pity was precisely how they had manipulated me. I exhaled unsteadily, letting anger flatten any momentary compassion. "Ronan," I demanded, "do me a favor and leave." His lips quivered, water dripping off his hair. "Please, Skylar." I stayed like a statue. "No," I said, voice cracking slightly. "All my life, I've been that gullible daughter who pays without asking questions. That ends here." After he went away, I sank onto my threadbare couch, my phone clutched in trembling hands. I pictured the messages over and over. Dad bragging about free membership at his golf club, courtesy of his unsuspecting daughter. Mom giggling in text that she almost felt bad. Almost, for funneling cash to exhilarating getaways. And Ronan saying I'd practically sign over my savings if he spun the right sob story. Feeling my stomach churn, I grabbed my laptop from a nearby table and brought up my bank statements. There they were. Monthly deposits of $3,000 to my parents' account for 5 solid years. Then the emergencies requiring lumps of cash, full coverage for imaginary root canals, furnace repairs in the dead of winter that never actually happened, medical bills that were apparently spent on car upgrades. I recalled how I'd forfeited a trip to Spain with friends because Dad said he needed urgent therapy for an undisclosed heart issue. I remembered reusing old furniture, cutting corners left and right, and skipping vacations so I could help them. For years, I believed I was saving them from the jaws of poverty. In reality, they'd been living it up at my expense. Crossing their fingers, I'd never realized the truth. I shivered. Enough, I thought. Slumping back against the couch, I wondered what to do next. Should I send a single warning or walk away for good? Before I decided, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. My heart hammered, but I answered, determined not to be bullied again. "Stop ignoring us," she barked the moment I said hello. "Your father's distressed, his blood pressure is crazy high thanks to you. We're your parents and we need to talk." That twisted a fresh knife of anger in me. Again, it was all my fault, apparently. They were the innocent, helpless victims. I said nothing, just listened with cold eyes fixed on the crack in my living room wall. She went on about how Dad was worried about losing the house, how they needed medication immediately, that ignoring them was immature. Deep down, I realized my mother would keep up the fear tactics. She believed that at any mention of possible medical crises, I'd come running with a checkbook. It was time to sever these puppet strings they'd so expertly tugged for years. I ended the call. Then I quickly tapped on my phone contacts, found my best friend Hannah, who also happened to be my attorney, and dialed her number. The second she answered, I blurted out the entire saga. The bleak texts, the humiliating truth about how I'd been used. "They said what?" Hannah exclaimed. "Sky, do not beat yourself up over this. You were doing what you thought was right." "I feel like an utter fool," I admitted. "No, they're the fools for scorning your kindness," she replied firmly. "What do you want to do now?" I paused, words lodging in my throat. "I guess I need to cut them off," I murmured. "At least for now, or maybe forever. I can't keep financing these lies. But we're financially entwined. My dad and mom are on several of my accounts. They're listed as dependents on my insurance. God, I never realized how everything was so tangled." Hannah's tone was all business. "Here's step 1. Gather proof. Every single bank statement, every conversation where they asked for help, every suspicious detail. Step 2. Figure out which connections you can sever legally. Step 3. Decide what you'll say to them before you do. A small, exhausted sigh escaped my lips as I recalled more ways I'd unknowingly trapped myself in this role. I'd set up a secret retirement fund for them, contributed monthly, and designated them as beneficiaries on my life insurance. It suddenly made me feel physically ill to see how thoroughly they had embedded themselves into my finances. Thanks, Hannah, I said quietly. Let me sort this out. Starting now. Once we hung up, my phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with my father's name. I pressed decline. The only message I sent back was short. Do not contact me. I know everything. I turned back to my laptop, opened a blank spreadsheet, and began listing all the so-called crises I'd covered for them. Dad's non-existent heart procedure, $4,500. Mom's busted furnace, $5,000. Dad's second urgent surgery, $3,000. Extra for property taxes they swore they couldn't pay, $4,000. The total soared. Each new line felt like pouring poison out of a wound. I was furious, but also heartbreakingly sad. How had the people who raised me, who should have valued my well-being, become so cavalier with my trust? And yet a little voice inside me warned that they wouldn't simply let go. The next days would bring wave after wave of calls, texts, pleas, and guilt trips. I realized I might not be ready for just how vindictive and manipulative they could become if they felt their golden goose slipping away. But one thing was absolutely certain. They'd gone too far, and I could never again unsee the vile things they'd written. Even if I wanted to pretend otherwise, the damage was already done. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I woke with a rare sense of determination. No more stalling, I told myself. This had to be sorted out once and for all, and there would be no turning back. Right after showering and throwing on sweats, I phoned my assistant to say I needed a personal day. Private matters had taken priority. Slipping into my kitchen, I brewed a mug of coffee, heart pounding at the thought of the steps I was about to take. First, I called the financial institution where I'd established a surprise retirement fund for my parents. It had always been in my name, so even though my father, Samuel, and my mother, Pearl, were the intended beneficiaries, I alone controlled its fate. I explained that I needed to close the entire account. An apologetic-sounding representative asked if something was wrong, and I merely said, "Let's just say circumstances have changed." That line felt like the greatest understatement of my life. When I hung up, I stared at my phone's screen, ignoring the lingering sting in my lungs. With that call, I'd just upended my parents' future nest egg, the very thing I once believed would grant them security in their golden years. But they'd proven themselves undeserving of the sacrifice. Next, I canceled the automatic $3,000 monthly transfer into their account. It felt jarring, but also made me unexpectedly lighter, as though I were removing invisible chains from my wrists. My second major errand was contacting the insurance provider where I'd listed my parents as dependents. I'd done it 2 years before, certain that Pearl's and Samuel's well-being was my duty to protect. Now, I was learning that they'd shielded me from nothing, while using me as a steady paycheck. When I reached customer service, I explained I was removing them. The agent hesitated, saying it was mid-year and typically complicated. "I'm sure there's a way," I said evenly. "They don't meet the criteria to remain on my plan." After another minute of checking policy guidelines, the agent did indeed find a path to terminate their coverage at the month's end. No more free rides. Finally, I turned to my life insurance, where my parents sat as primary beneficiaries. Within minutes, I eliminated them, replacing them with an organization that helped underprivileged kids go to camp. I remembered how proud I'd once been to name Pearl and Samuel, feeling so certain that if anything ever happened to me, at least my parents would be safe. Now I simply felt numb, but also strangely relieved. Relief didn't last long, though. That very afternoon, I saw Ronan's name flash across my phone screen. My gut told me to send it straight to voicemail, but I needed to know what he would say this time. When I picked up, he wasted no time. "What did you do?" His words were sharp, almost panicked. "Mom tried refilling Dad's prescription at the pharmacy, and it got declined because he's no longer on your plan. Are you serious?" I couldn't help noticing the total absence of an apology in his voice. "Yes, I'm serious, I answered calmly. They're adults, and they're more than capable of handling their own bills. Just like I said. He sucked in air, as though trying to muster some sense of righteousness. You're going to let Dad go without his meds just because you're mad? I refused to engage with that attempt at guilt tripping. They've lied about half of those prescriptions. How do I even know they're valid? And if they are, well, there are resources they can use on their own. You're unbelievable, he muttered, and then a beep signaled he'd hung up. I set my phone aside, exhaling in frustration. My own brother seemed to think I was the villain. Meanwhile, I was the one who'd been exploited for years. Half an hour later, my cell chimed with a text from Samuel. Heard what you did to our accounts. This is low, Skylar. Call me immediately. We can fix this. Fix this, I thought cynically. The only thing they wanted to fix was the lack of cash flow. There was no mention of feelings or regret. Just money, money, money. I refused to write back, burying myself in gathering evidence of every manufactured crisis they'd inflicted on me. I scrolled through 5 years' worth of statements, each entry feeling like a fresh betrayal. The furnace fiasco, the broken transmission, the mystery physical therapy. In the end, the total soared to an amount that made my stomach twist. What hurt more was remembering every personal sacrifice I'd made. Vacations postponed, riskier investments avoided, stress-fueled nights, while they partied on my dime. By early evening, I'd saved an extensive digital folder containing copies of texts, bank screenshots, and even the deposit receipts my parents had so smugly collected. My best friend and lawyer Hannah had requested everything, should the situation escalate into some legal nightmare. For once, I took comfort in being prepared, in knowing exactly how much they'd siphoned off. Still, even with so much overwhelming proof, my chest clutched with mixed feelings. Sure, I was furious, but there was also a flicker of heartache. I'd spent years believing Pearl and Samuel were helpless, only to discover they'd scorned me every step of the way. Next, I wondered, after today, would they pursue more drastic methods to get their money back? Or was this the final straw that would drive them to my doorstep in a last-ditch effort to invade my life again? That possibility curved around in my mind like a dark storm cloud as nighttime fell. 3 days passed in an eerie hush. I kept expecting my phone to blow up with frantic calls or texts from my parents, but everything stayed unnervingly silent. By the end of the 3rd day, I felt more uneasy than relieved. They weren't the sort of people to accept a dead end without at least trying to pry it open. Maybe they'd finally realized how low they'd stooped. Or maybe they were merely planning the next ambush. That question was answered that evening around 8:30, when my doorbell suddenly echoed through the living room. Any hope that it might be a friend popped like a weak balloon the moment I squinted through the peephole. Mom and Dad were on the porch, along with Ronan. They looked furious and desperate, which turned my stomach into a pit of dread. I froze, not sure if I should respond. Memories rocketed through my mind. Dad's phone messages calling me clueless. Mom's mocking texts about me footing the bills for their next treat. Ronan's half-hearted attempts to absolve himself. The doorbell chimed again, more insistent this time, accompanied by firm knocking. I pressed my lips into a line and decided not to let them in. Instead, I grabbed my phone and quietly dialed Hannah, who'd warned me this might happen. They're here, I whispered, keeping my voice low, as if they could somehow hear me through the door. They're pounding on the door and demanding we talk. Don't let them inside, Hannah advised in a clipped tone. If they refuse to leave, you call the police. They're no longer welcome in your space. I bit my lip and checked the spy hole again. Dad was glaring, eyes scanning for any sign of light in the windows. Mom wiped her eyes, then mouthed something to Ronan, who tried calling my name. Skylar, come on. Just open the door for 1 minute. You can't shut us out forever. I let the phone slip from my ear, then cautiously raised my voice. I have nothing to say, I announced through the door, forcing a steady tone I barely felt. I've asked you to stop contacting me. I'm serious. Go away. For a few seconds, the only sound was the pounding of my heart. Then Dad barked, You will regret this. We're your parents. Under normal circumstances, that might have stung, but I'd replayed enough of their messages to know what that label meant to them. To them, being parents meant unlimited credit for lavish activities. Mom began pounding again with the flat of her palm. "Skylar, we'll stand out here all night if that's what you want." I battled a flare of guilt, but recalled Hannah's words. If I let them in once, they'd see it as an opening to manipulate me again. Instead of giving in, I simply repeated, "Leave, or I'll phone the police." After a tense pause, I heard vague whispers and saw them shuffle off my porch. Dad muttered a few insults at the door, but they eventually disappeared into the night. My relief was so powerful, I almost sank to the floor. Still, my body buzzed with leftover anxiety, unresolved anger swirling in my chest. In each of their faces, I'd recognized the panic of someone who'd broken a vital lifeline. They weren't sorry they did it. They were sorry their safety net was gone. Predictably, they didn't give up. The very next day, I woke to find an email from Mom's account. The subject line, "Your father is not well." Rolling my eyes, I clicked it open and read. As expected, it focused on how Dad's blood pressure was skyrocketing because of my cruelty and how they couldn't possibly pay their condo mortgage without a cash infusion from me. That if they lost the condo, I'd be to blame for letting my parents become homeless. The word homeless glowed on my laptop screen, turning my stomach. I forwarded the message to Hannah. In my reply to Mom, I kept it short. "Stop. I'm not paying your bills. You made your choices." Then I braced for whatever emotional grenades they might lob next. Sure enough, I soon received a certified letter in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note that dripped with flattery and condemnation all at once. "We never meant to hurt you, dear, but you have no idea the stress we're under. Your father is gravely worried about your stubbornness, especially given his fragile condition. Could you really ignore us until we lose our last shred of dignity?" They painted themselves as helpless victims, conveniently skipping over the fact that they'd used me like a bank for half a decade. I noticed a line referencing Dad's expensive prescriptions, supposedly $400 a month now that he was off my plan. That figure lit my fuse of suspicion. I dialed the local pharmacy they usually patronized, calmly inquiring about the real cost of Dad's medication, pretending to be verifying details for insurance. After some clacking on a keyboard, the pharmacist quoted me a total of $46. So they'd inflated the number tenfold just to manipulate me again. I hung up, feeling hollow yet vindicated. How many more lies had they told to bleed me dry? This was precisely the reason I'd drawn that line in the sand. They'd never admit wrongdoing unless it forced me to reopen my wallet. By that same afternoon, another short text from Ronan arrived. "We need to talk. Don't ignore me." The blockade I'd constructed around my heart felt shaky for a moment, but I steadied myself, reminding my battered conscience that he'd gleefully contributed to my exploitation. I left the message unanswered. While I hoped the storm would soon blow over, part of me feared it was only gathering strength. But no matter what approach they took next, begging, bullying, or guilt, I was determined not to fall back under their sway. They had crossed lines I couldn't unsee, and I would never again be the old Skylar they'd so smugly mocked in their private conversations. On the fourth day of uneasy calm, my phone rang at an unexpected hour. I glanced down, blinking in surprise at the name on the screen. It wasn't Mom, Dad, or Ronan. It was my Uncle Pete, who lived clear across the state in a small coastal town called Crescent Bay. We'd never been particularly close, yet here he was, calling out of the blue. Part of me worried that maybe my parents had convinced him to intervene. Still, I was curious enough to answer. "Skylar," Uncle Pete began, voice hesitant. I, got a confusing call from your dad, complaining about some financial situation and wanting to move in with my wife and me until they got back on their feet. He said you'd not only cut them off, but were also punishing them unfairly. I knew something was fishy, so I wanted to hear your side." I closed my eyes, realizing exactly what was happening. My parents were scrambling to find a new sponsor now that I'd closed the purse strings. I explained the entire ugly revelation, how my parents had deceived me for years, how Ronan played along, and how I'd uncovered one smug text after another. I left out no detail, finishing with, "They're furious that I'm no longer paying for everything, so they're spinning a sad tale to anyone who'll listen. Uncle Pete sighed. I'm not shocked. Your father's always had a slippery way of coaxing money out of people. They tried turning to me decades ago, but I kept my wallet shut. That's why your dad and I don't keep in touch, I suppose. Hearing that sent a twinge of regret through me, imagining how much heartbreak might have been spared if Uncle Pete had warned me earlier. But then again, I could almost predict how I would have reacted. My parents would have convinced me he was the family black sheep, that he was out to sow discord. I'd have dismissed it, never suspecting what they were really doing. In a calmer tone, I told him, well, at least I know I'm not alone in seeing them for what they really are. I'm sorry you got hurt, he said gently. But I told your dad no, they can't crash here. If they need a place, they'll have to look elsewhere. Maybe they'll finally realize how out of line they've been. Once we said our goodbyes, a familiar heaviness returned to my chest. I couldn't decide whether I felt vindicated or just sad. But there was also relief to know at least someone else saw through my parents' manipulations and wasn't blaming me. Shortly afterward, I decided to take Dr. Brooks's advice and treat myself to a little break from my usual routine. Dr. Brooks was my therapist, whom I'd started meeting online for weekly sessions. She kept encouraging me to carve out positive rituals, reminding me that my self-worth had nothing to do with whether I financed family members or not. So I left my phone on silent and jogged around the neighborhood, letting crisp morning air clear my mind. It felt foreign to be outside without a phone pressed to my ear, skipping urgent calls or messages from my parents. Yet I realized, as I ran, all that tension was slowly unwinding. That evening, an email arrived from a mutual acquaintance, a friend of Pearl's, someone I vaguely remembered from various holiday gatherings. Like so many messages these days, it began with a polite greeting, launching into a request that I patch things up and extend some grace to my parents. The friend wrote how terrible life had become for them. The condo was dangerously close to foreclosure, and my dad was supposedly losing weight from stress. They mentioned maybe having no choice but to sell off their possessions. I know you're hurt, but can't you just talk to them? The email urged. Reading it, I felt the familiar sting of guilt, but I replayed some lines from the chat transcripts in my head. She's gullible enough to pay for whatever we want. Those words snapped me out of my remorse. I tapped out a short response. I appreciate your concern, but this isn't something that can be fixed by me surrendering more money. They made their choices, and I made mine. Then I sent it off, feeling oddly calm. During my next therapy session, I confessed to Dr. Brooks that I still felt a persistent ache of sadness, though the fierce anger had subsided somewhat. I guess I'm mourning the family I never truly had, I said. I loved the parents I imagined, but they were never real. She nodded, her expression empathetic. All grief is complicated, but especially when it's connected to betrayal. It makes you question everything, including your own judgment. I swallowed, blinking back emotion. Yes, exactly. I constantly ask myself, how did I not see it? It's normal to experience that, Dr. Brooks replied. Give yourself time. Acknowledge your heartbreak without letting it lure you back into a dynamic that dismisses your well-being. Those words stayed with me over the next few days. The mental pressure didn't vanish, but I felt less tormented by the swirl of half-formed worries and regrets. I continued ignoring messages from my family and from friends who tried to guilt-trip me into forgiving them. A week later, I received yet another heart-tugging letter from my mother. This one, though, had a different tone. Syrupy sweet at first, then frantic. She claimed Dad had never intended to talk badly about me. All those nasty screenshots I'd found were taken completely out of context. She insisted they'd never meant to trick me into anything. Instead, they were just joking, poking fun at how easily I jumped to help. She wrote as if my hurt feelings were irrational overreactions. As I scanned her words, I recognized how she was shifting blame onto me, subtly implying that if I'd had a better sense of humor, none of this would have escalated. Finally, she ended with, "We're begging you, be the bigger person and move on. Dad is so distraught he can't sleep." She didn't once mention that she was sorry for mocking my sacrifices or using the cash as her personal windfall. There was no sincere remorse. It was just another ploy. I tucked her letter away without replying. It sounds cold, I thought. But what was the point of rehashing the same arguments? Every conversation seemed scripted. I'd demand an explanation, they'd dodge, then they'd cry for forgiveness without truly acknowledging the damage done. In the midst of all that emotional chaos, Hannah came through with a thorough summary of my finances, dated copies of wire transfers, a timeline of so-called emergencies, and proof that I'd been systematically scammed. "This is just for your personal records," she told me over the phone. "I don't think they'll take you to court. Not when they have nothing to stand on. But peace of mind never hurts." "Thank you," I replied, meaning it. Seeing everything laid out in black and white made accepting the truth easier. Still, with each day that passed, I wondered if my parents would abruptly show up again at my door. Part of me dreaded it. Another part wanted them to come, just so I could shut the door in their faces all over again and remind myself how far I'd come from that naive daughter who believed any sob story. It was an unsettling duality, the desire to maintain distance paired with the drive to confirm that I was truly free. By then, though, one thing was crystal clear. There was no going back, and I was finally learning to be okay with that. Nearly 6 months passed in gradual, tentative peace. Other than a few half-hearted attempts by my parents to breach my silence, the chaos began to settle. My therapy appointments continued each week, and though the sadness still lingered, I started feeling lighter, more optimistic about the life I was rebuilding without my family's claws in my finances. I'd stopped jumping every time the phone buzzed, had begun to enjoy hobbies again. Long hikes, weekend trips with close friends, all the things I used to postpone so I could funnel money to my parents. Eventually, I spent a few nights out of town on business for my consultancy. It felt refreshing to distance myself from the tensions at home, if only for a short while. On the drive back, I felt a cautious hope that maybe the worst was behind me, that maybe, finally, I could move forward. But as I pulled into my driveway that evening, I spotted two figures perched on my front steps in the fading sunlight. Samuel's hunched shoulders were unmistakable, and Pearl sat beside him, arms around her knees. My heart sank. Even from the car, I could tell they had come prepared to beg, or maybe to argue. The last thing I wanted was another showdown. Still, now that I was orchestrating my own life, I refused to cower. I cut the car engine and stepped out slowly, squaring my shoulders. They got to their feet before I made it halfway up the walk. My father looked thinner, his cheeks sunken in a way I'd never seen before. My mother's hair, once expertly highlighted, had grown out, revealing gray roots. Her clothes were faded, worn in a way that didn't match her usual taste for fancy blouses. "Skylar," Pearl said quietly, as though trying to melt my defenses. "We've been waiting." A tightness seized my chest, but I nodded stiffly. "Hello," I said. "I see that." I paused just short of them, gripping my suitcase handle. "What do you want?" "We heard you'd been out of town," Samuel said, voice subdued. "We wanted to catch you in person." I studied them both, searching for any sign of true remorse. "You found me?" I replied, trying to keep my tone even. "But you need to know. I'm not reinstating what you lost." Pearl's eyes brimmed with tears. "Can we just talk inside for a moment?" I didn't move. Images of their past visits came flooding back. How they'd cornered me, hammered me with guilt, forced me to stand firm. But 6 months of therapy had given me clarity, and I wasn't about to be coerced just because they wore pitiful expressions. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said firmly, stepping back toward my front door. "Anything you want to say can be said out here." Pearl dropped her gaze. "We've lost everything," she said, her voice wobbling. "We sold the condo at a loss and had to move in with Ronan. It's humiliating." She paused, as though waiting for me to soften. "We know we messed up, Skylar. That's the reason we're here." Samuel shifted, uncomfortably aware that I wasn't responding with tears and apologies of my own. "Your mother's right. These past months, we've had to rely on Kevin's charity. We see now how it feels, being dependent on someone else's goodwill." "Then I guess you have an inkling of what I felt," I said. "Except I helped out of genuine kindness. You milked me because you considered me a fool. That's a big difference." He started to protest, but I raised my hand. "Stop. I read your messages, remember? The ones where you mocked me behind my back. If you want to convince me you've changed, maybe start by owning what you did without trying to rewrite it. Pearl swallowed hard. We were cruel, she conceded softly. We let the money get to our heads. We were so used to not having anything in life, and suddenly it was like we could afford things we never dreamt of. I guess we got carried away. Carried away, I repeated flatly, years of scorn and betrayal pushing on my heart. You used me. Period. Pearl's face sagged with regret, and for once it looked real. I can't deny it, Skylar. Samuel cleared his throat, struggling to maintain some dignity. I've had time to think. I never intended to push you to the edge, but we took advantage and we are truly sorry. We do hope one day you'll forgive us. He paused right there, waiting to see whether his apology resonated. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant chirp of evening crickets. My thoughts wandered to the version of them I'd loved unconditionally, the parents I thought needed my help. That dream had evaporated, replaced by the truth. Forgiveness isn't a magic word that erases the damage, I finally said. Even if I get to that place in my heart, it doesn't mean I'll go back to financing you. How do I know you're not just telling me what you think I want to hear, so I'll open my checkbook again? At that, Mom's tears finally spilled. I don't expect you to trust us, she whispered. I wouldn't either after what we've done. She reached for my wrist, and I took a quick step back, not ready for that physical gesture. She let her hand fall. We understand, Samuel said. You're not the same person we used to walk all over. We just want you to know we're sorry. I took in a shaky breath. Part of me yearned to cling to the faint hope that maybe they meant it, that they would do better. But somewhere deep inside, I knew not to let my guard down. I accept that you regret your actions, I said, eyeing them both. But it's going to take more than words to convince me you've changed. Pearl nodded, tears dropping to the ground. Even if some portion of their regret was real, it was overshadowed by the realization of how far they had fallen. For a few more minutes, we stood there like that, a triangle of wounded, wary souls. Finally, I cleared my throat. That's all I have in me tonight. I hope you'll understand I'm not inviting you in. Without arguing, my mother stepped aside and my father painfully exhaled. Take care of yourself, he muttered, voice hoarse. Then they turned and walked to the curb, where an older car sat waiting to whisk them off. I stood there, heart pounding, watching until the taillights vanished into the dusk. Inside, I slid to the floor, back pressed to the door. For a few long moments, I just breathed, letting the tension ebb away. I wasn't jumping for joy, but I wasn't collapsing in sorrow either. Perhaps this was how I'd know I was healing, acknowledging the conversation had happened, yet standing firm in the boundaries I'd set. I might still grieve the fantasy of a loving family, but at last I was refusing to be the open wallet they once thought I'd always be.